Hey folks, welcome to your first online asynchronous lecture. As I mentioned yesterday, Monday, this lecture will consist of this video in which I will cover the rest of the content that I didn't get to on Monday, and probably go through it pretty quickly, just kind of emphasize and highlight a few things, bring up a few examples for you, and then the rest of the lecture or the session will consist of completing those logbook activities. So there'll be a few things for you to complete with that that you'll be able to do again on your own time. So that said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through this material, but I do want to, as I mentioned, cover a couple of quick things. So let's get into it. Okay, I know this is going back a couple of slides, but I did want to just kind of cover from the logical start of a section here, and so I'll really quickly go through those first couple of approaches to studying personality that we had kind of already covered in class, and then get on to the rest of these and then move forward from there. So just that psychodynamic approach again, I know we kind of discussed the premise of what it is, coming from Freud and Neo-Freudian psychology, and the emphasis on sort of the unconscious and childhood experiences, conflicts, and so on. So just to kind of really recap that, basically in sports, not generally used as much, although we could look at things like choking, for example, as being resulting from sort of unresolved conflicts or unconscious anxieties that kind of surface under stress. There is a well-known story about or an anecdote about an NFL kicker, Scott Norwood, who essentially choked on a pretty simple, at least for him, kickoff, or not kickoff, I should say, field goal attempt that ended up going, well, it was known as wide right. It was in Super Bowl 25. And later on, after in interviews, he had admitted to a real intense fear of sort of letting people down, which just shows that how that deep-seated anxieties can really kind of intrude. So there are good reasons still why we might want to be aware of this, at least. There's a lot of sort of hidden motives that can drive behavior. Athletes might not be consciously aware of why they're acting the way they do, and this can be sort of uncovered through psychodynamic approach. So often there are sort of emotional hot buttons or certain triggers that really tend to provoke these disproportionate reactions from athletes. And these may stem from sort of unresolved past experiences or self-esteem issues and not be really that related to the current situation. And again, that's something that could be uncovered through psychodynamic. Sometimes mental health concerns can sort of crop up or come out through sort of struggles and through experiences in sport, and so this is something that is better dealt with somebody who would be a qualified clinical psychologist, of course, and I kind of talked a little bit about that and the differences between that and an educational psychologist or a sports psychology consultant. So anyways, there are reasons why we'd want to know about it, but generally speaking, it doesn't have a large influence in sports psychology typically. Doesn't really consider sort of the social dynamics, the circumstances, and really attributes pretty much everything to these internal things that are going on. So that's a psychodynamic approach. Again, did talk a little bit about trait behavior, so won't spend much time, but just briefly again, this is considering the sort of philosophy that traits are these relatively stable and consistent aspects to our personality. You can think of them almost like personality fingerprints. Athletes with high conscientiousness, for example, will often adhere better to training regimens. Those who are higher in extroversion will probably thrive more in team sports. However, as we kind of talked about already, there is, of course, other variabilities that traits just don't explain. So situational context and so on. So we don't necessarily get that sense of the variability that we see from context to context through different situations. So and so we're not necessarily going to always act, or our athletes won't necessarily always act in the same way, across time and across situations, despite having fairly strong traits that are exemplified in one way or another. So, and I did mention this or talk about this, and this is also in your textbook, but just to again reiterate, the Big Five is sort of the most well-known of the models for the trait approaches, and it's got these five sort of continuums or aspects to it: neuroticism, extroversion, conscientiousness, agreeableness, intellectual openness, or openness to experience. So, and these, we tend to fall somewhere on a spectrum on each one of these aspects of this model, and there's all kinds of different measures for this. There's a link in this PowerPoint. The Big Five here is linked to one such test where you can get some information about this if you're interested. So just a couple other quick comments about the Big Five as it relates to exercise and sport. Some of the more robust findings around them. Extroversion and conscientiousness are both positively correlated with physical activity levels, whereas neuroticism, so that's high levels of neuroticism, in other words, that's nervousness, self-doubt, and so on, are negatively related to physical activity. And in addition to that, generally speaking, athletes tend to show higher levels of extroversion than as compared to non-athletes. Athletes who play high-risk sports and team sports also score higher on extroversion and lower on conscientiousness than athletes who play low-risk sports and individual sports. Finally, traits do have some usefulness in predicting behavior across a number of situations, but generally speaking, the effects are pretty small. Okay, moving on to perfectionism, which I did start to talk about a little bit last day, but just to get into this one. So before I do talk about perfectionism, there is this link, and I kind of mentioned that on Monday, this video that talks about the way that we sort of raise or treat or educate boys versus girls. So there is the link in this PowerPoint slide, but I will also link this just in your Blackboard as well, and have you watch that video. And then, as I mentioned in class, I'd like to kind of think about this whole idea of the differences in gender. And given the video is a little bit older, a little bit aged, is sort of decide for yourself, sort of think about from your own perspective, sort of anecdotally, does this still hold true? The premise and the ideas that she presents in this video, is it still relevant today? And I'm not saying that it is or isn't one way or the other. I want you to decide for yourselves. And then we will actually do a little bit of discussion around that in the next class. So you can either pause it now, this video now, and go find that link and watch that video, or you can do it at another time. You don't have to. So. Okay, so I did mention this as well in class, that perfectionism is one of the most widely studied personality characteristics in sports psychology recently. So perfectionism, there's a number of aspects to perfectionism. So first of all, there's this, this has been around for a while, the notion that it is sort of a multi-dimensional construct. So there's lots of different facets to it, I guess, and there's different ways of conceptualizing this and different measures that have been designed around those ideas. So one of the approaches is that it's sort of divided into this setting of high standards, this feeling of concerns over making mistakes, and then this being highly organized. That's just one approach, though. There are a number of other approaches. Perfectionism can be defined as essentially being a personality style that's characterized by setting extremely high standards of performance, striving for flawlessness, and a tendency to be overly critical in evaluating one's performance. So there's a lot of controversy about whether or not perfectionism is sort of more of a positive trait or a negative trait, at least when it comes to achieving success. And it generally kind of depends on what aspects of those different components of it are really kind of amplified or emphasized. So yeah, there is a possibility for perfectionism to be something that could be sort of deemed adaptive or positive, again in terms of performance at least, but it can also be very maladaptive and very negative. And it kind of, as I said, it just depends on which of the qualities or which of the dimensions are sort of higher within a given athlete versus other ones. So, and again, all of that also depends on the conceptualization, and there are a number of different models of what perfectionism actually is, what the dimensions are. Another model that has proposed the multi-dimensional aspect of perfectionism is this one here, which sort of posits that perfectionism can be self-oriented. So in other words, the standards that one holds for oneself. Socially prescribed refers to how much a person or an athlete or somebody believes others hold high standards for that person. And then other-oriented perfectionism refers to how much or how high of standards we hold for other people. And typically we're talking about people that are sort of related to whatever the performance is. So that typically would mean like teammates and so on. But could be coaches, could be other support members of the team, whatever. So coming back to that idea of perfectionism being positive or negative or adaptive or maladaptive, one of the most robust findings in the study of perfectionism has been this sort of conceptualizing of perfectionistic striving versus perfectionistic concern. And so striving is sort of more that aiming for really high achievement, having really high standards for oneself, not the sort of flip side of that, or the reverse of that, would being the perfectionistic concern, where it's these worries and these concerns over whether or not we're achieving those high standards. And so differences maybe seems a bit subtle, but there is they are two distinct different things, and that has been found to be very closely related to whether or not perfectionism can be positive or negative, or adaptive or maladaptive. Another aspect about perfectionism is this notion of whether or not it is something that should be studied and considered or treated as if it is sort of just this generic kind of global or domain-free personality trait that kind of is applied in across situations, or whether it is something that should be considered a domain-specific construct. So in other words, are people perfectionistic in only certain domains or certain facets of their life, like sport or academia or music or what have you? And there is a lot of good evidence that supports the study of and the treatment of perfectionism as being domain specific. And this is actually an area and a topic that I've spent a lot of time studying myself. My graduate thesis was all around the domain-specific nature of perfectionism. And further to that, actually, what I looked at in my study and further research has been done since is how much of sort of the perceived importance that one, an athlete or whatever, places on the domain. So let's say it's in sport. How much that has an impact on their level of perfectionism, as well as their perceived competence. So that's also something that's considered to be a influence on one's level of perfectionism. So in other words, how confident does one feel in that specific domain? And that's been shown to have some impact on the level of perfectionism. So just to wrap up the discussion on perfectionism, just last comment here, there is a lot, again, around this, lots of strategies and so on, but just really kind of generally speaking, it's important to really kind of consider and to try to make this distinction between what we'd call like a healthy commitment to high performance, right? Having high standards, high expectations for oneself, and avoiding this sort of really unhealthy strivings or concerns about not achieving those high standards, which will tend to lead to the more maladaptive or unhealthy perfectionism. All right, so just wrapping up the trait approach, this generally doesn't have a lot of influence on sport psychologists. It doesn't necessarily help us to know how athletes are going to behave or act in certain situations because there is the situation to consider as well. So it's probably not generally going to be something that we're going to solely use as a means of helping our athletes. Okay, the next approach here is the situational approach, and so one of the things you're going to need to do that ties into this is that athletic coping skills inventory. It's also titled the Survey of Athletic Experiences. So you're going to complete this as well, and just when you do it, just obviously, so it refers to playing baseball, so just refer it to playing a sport or doing a sport that you can connect with. It doesn't have to be baseball, so just in any kind of performance sports setting, preferably if possible. So, and just answer the questions as honestly as you can as you complete it. And then there is the scoring key there for you to follow to interpret the results of that. So so anyways, situational, this is where we consider the situation, obviously, and it's still probably a very narrow and not all that effective method or approach to considering and predicting behaviors in sport. It does give us some ideas or some sense on, when we see these kind of what we would call split personalities often, so really dramatically different kinds of behaviors in the sport or competitive setting versus what we see outside of those settings, right? And hockey is a great example. We see all kinds of violent type behaviors that, taken out of context or in a different normal everyday context, would most likely be arrested for, whereas on the ice, if it's hockey, is just considered kind of a normal thing. But take those same athletes and put them in a different setting, a different context, and we see completely different behaviors. So anyways, the situation can determine a lot, but of course, it still is has its weaknesses. Definitely does not do a great job of explaining all kinds of behaviors and attitudes and performances. And really, what we want to do is take this interactional approach. And so for this one, you're going to part of the learning log that you're going to be submitting is this: how I spent time outside the classroom. And it's pretty self-explanatory, so you just go through and complete that, and that will be also something you will be submitting for this. And anyways, coming back to this, the interactional approach obviously is one that considers both the personality traits and the situation, and is pretty much what is used today as the way of trying to predict athletes' behaviors and giving them strategies and helping with their performance. So, it's sort of a more specific kind of trait approach is the phenomenological approach, and in this case, in addition to considering both the personality characteristics or traits of the athlete and the situation, it's also a little bit about the interpretation that athlete takes to that situation, right? So different athletes can have, very similar personality makeups and be in the same situation, but they have different interpretations, and so that will result in different performance levels of performance and different behaviors. Okay, so again, not really any weaknesses. This is really just, as I said, a specific type of the interactional approach, and is used primarily by sports psychologists. The integrative or biopsychosocial approach, biopsychosocial is spelled wrong here, I just noticed that, but anyways, this is just sort of a relatively new kind of way of treating personality and working with athletes, in that it kind of considers like the whole person, right? So biopsychosocial means we consider the sort of the physiology of the person, their genetic traits, their personality characteristics, and emotions, as along with sort of the context and the situation. So all of that kind of grouped all together, and so it's this more holistic kind of view, and it's something that, as I said, is relatively new. There's not a lot of studies or evidence on it yet, but it does show a lot of promise in being maybe kind of the more preferred method in the future for sports psychologists. Okay, moving on, just going to briefly touch on this aspect of the use of personality or psychological tests for a variety of purposes. So just a few sort of thought-provoking questions here. To begin with, is this something that should be used solely as a means of selecting athletes for a team? And is this also an effective way to determine if somebody is going to be successful in the sport? So, and if we are considering these two things, then just how and when should we be doing this? And so your textbook does a good job of kind of breaking this down and talking about the context in which it should be used and the best practices. And so just a quick summary of those things. So to begin with, just recognizing the sort of general principles of testing, and the fact that there is always going to be some margin of error in tests. So through a variety of reasons, I mentioned one of those, social desirability. So in self-report questionnaires and so on, people will tend to want to answer in a way they think should be answering. So there's that. There's also having some knowledge of the validity of the test, right? So how well was this, the creation of this test, how valid is it, how truthful are the scores in measuring what we're wanting it to measure, right? So there are some good or better tests out there and some worse tests, and some that are reliable and some that are not. So having an understanding of the psychometric properties, so that's how good the tests are, right? And then again, people just will tend to skew their responses in ways that they kind of maybe consciously, maybe unconsciously feel they should be answering. Okay. In addition to that, there are certain tests are required to know. It is required to know about how it should be conducted. So there may be aspects to conducting the test that your average person is not going to be aware of, and so the environment, the way the questions are asked, the wording, just lots of different variables there and nuances, and then interpretation as well. Oftentimes there is maybe a key of some kind, but sometimes it requires some level of skill or ability. It's generally not recommended that we use a psychological or personality test solely as a means of selecting teams or selecting our athletes on our teams or for programs. So it could be something that is used in conjunction with a number of other processes and so on, but certainly should not be the sole means. Okay. Anytime we conduct testing, personality testing or psychological testing, complete transparency and communication around, what it's for, what it's about, any kind of feedback that can result from it, right? So all of that kind of stuff should be shared with the athlete. Of course, confidentiality is critical here. So any information obtained through the collection of that information should not be shared with anybody else. And taking an intra-individual approach just means that when we're considering the value of these tests, that we need to consider the person themselves and how they feel relative to at that in that situation, relative to other times, not compared with other people. Okay. And then having some understanding of course, the aspects of personality, right? So we talked a lot about that already. So that is obviously important in being able to make use of any kind of personality tests. Okay, lastly, just going to touch on the aspect of cognitive strategies and mental plans, an important component that elite athletes will have and make use of in being successful in their sport. So going along with that, the learning log section for this is the cognitive strategies and athletic performance interview. So you're going to find an athlete, the higher level the better, but whatever you can get is fine, and you're going to then interview that person based on the questions that are in that document, and then compare that with the sort of the mental strategies of successful athletes that's summarized in your textbook. So just briefly, cognitive strategies, mental strategies, these are sort of the toolbox of skills and behaviors that athletes will use in competition particularly when it comes to certain situations that could potentially interrupt or distract from being focused on what needs to be focused on. So, okay. So in addition to the cognitive strategies interview, there is also this item which I would like you to complete as part of your learning log. So this is a refocus plan. You're going to use for a hypothetical athlete. You can choose a sport that you'd like to apply this to, and this is something that the athlete, you're going to come up with a number of scenarios that could potentially interrupt or, like I said, interfere with the athlete's performance, distract them in some way, shape, or form, and then develop some strategies for them. And there is example in your textbook on page 54, 49 in the 7th edition. And this will be included in your learning log. And here's also another example here for an Olympic alpine skier. And so it's a variety of different situations that, again, could kind of interfere with that focus. And then what are some strategies to come up with to help them be able to refocus. So yeah, you can use this or the textbook as example to help you with that one. Okay, and that wraps up the personality. So you're going to finally do that personality wrap up. So just some reflection on just your own components of personality and your answers to the questions in the learning log that you've done, what you've just sort of discovered about yourself and your own psychological core, and any other aspects of personality. So that you kind of feel you've learned a little bit about in going through this process. So just a few things. So we need to consider both the traits or the genetics and the situations or the environment in dealing with athletes and working with athletes. In terms of conducting tests, we want to be well informed and apply all those best practices that I talked about. Open, good communication is critical and key in being transparent with our athletes. Always trying to observe what's going on, along with making use of the other tools that we talked about, personality tests and discussion and communication. We want to make sure we're very well informed in terms of like those coping strategies. What are some things that can be done to help our athletes? So next week we'll be moving on to chapter 3, motivation. So we'll start with the quiz again on Monday. Again, that's an open book, and you can bring notes in. You can use your textbook, but do have read the chapter beforehand so that you're prepared for that. So that's it. We'll see you guys next week.